Good afternoon, and welcome to the United States Food and Drug Administration Stakeholder Webinar to provide an overview of the recently released draft guidance outlining new voluntary targets for sodium reduction in foods, as well as a preliminary assessment of progress between 2010 and 2022. I am Janisha Robs with the FDA's Human Foods Program, Office of Communication, Education, and Engagement. In a moment, I will turn the call over to Dr. Robin McKinnon, Acting Director for FDA's Human Foods Program Nutrition Center of Excellence, and Ms. Casey Heinz, Nutrition Scientist, also in FDA's Human Foods Program Nutrition Center of Excellence, and they will be providing an overview of the draft guidance and preliminary assessment of progress. After the presentation, we will move to the question and answer portion of the call, where Ms. Lauren Zilver, mathematical statistician within the FDA's Human Foods Program, will join Dr. McKinnon and Ms. Heinz to answer questions. With that, I will now turn the call over to Dr. Robin McKinnon and Ms. Casey Heinz.
Thanks, Janisha. So today we'd like to provide an update on our efforts at the FDA to help improve dietary patterns in the US and public health overall, focusing in on our sodium reduction initiative. In terms of flow, we'll be reviewing our recent announcement, providing some background, then we'll discuss the development of the draft guidance as well as the preliminary assessment of progress in sodium reduction, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. As a quick refresher, on August 15th, we announced the draft of our new voluntary targets, and we also issued a preliminary assessment of progress, comparing data from 2010 and 2022, and we announced that we plan to issue a formal evaluation of industry's progress towards the phase 1 targets once the 2024 data are available and can be analyzed. And going forward, we intend to assess progress on sodium reduction relative to the targets about every 3 years. So food can certainly be a source of wellness, and FDA regulates the safety and labeling of about 80% of the US food supply. And our nutrition initiatives are part of a broader whole of government approach focused on helping to reduce the burden of diet-related chronic disease and advancing health equity through helping to create a healthier food supply, establishing a healthier start, and empowering consumers with information to build a healthy diet. And our work on sodium reduction speaks to this first area, supporting a healthier food supply. And this initiative is part of the White House National Strategy on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. And this chart here shows sodium intakes by age and sex and the percent of the population above the 0 line. Let me just show you here, that's the percent of the population that exceeds the recommended intake upper limits to reduce the risk of chronic disease. And you can see at a glance that the vast majority exceed recommended upper limits. And this is a major issue because excess sodium increases risk for high blood pressure and heart disease and stroke, which are the leading causes of death and disease in the US. Over 100 million American adults have high blood pressure. It's almost half of all adults. And for African American adults, it's almost 60%. So moving the needle here in supporting reductions in sodium intake could broadly improve population health. And in fact, researchers have estimated that reducing sodium intake could save hundreds of thousands of lives in years to come. Now, sodium reduction targets for industry are needed because most sodium consumed in the US is already in our food. So looking at the pie chart here, more than 70% of our sodium is from packaged and prepared foods, not from the smaller slices of the pie shown in gray and orange here that are added at home in cooking or at the table. And so it can be very challenging to stay within recommended limits for sodium given our food supply. But we know that it's possible to reduce sodium in foods because of the variability that we see in foods sold internationally and also domestically. I'm showing here an example of essentially the same product sold internationally. See the countries on the left-hand side with very different sodium levels on the right-hand column. And we see that same kind of variability here in the US within food categories, like bread, for instance. So the approach that we're taking at the FDA, voluntary reductions across a broad array of food categories, that's shown success in other countries. For example, in Canada and the UK, they've seen reductions in sodium intake, and the UK even saw reductions in heart disease and stroke. So in 2021, we issued final guidance for industry with 2.5-year voluntary targets, which we're now calling phase 1 targets. And as mentioned in August of this year, we issued draft 3-year phase 2 targets for 163 categories of food to support further reductions in sodium. And both of these guidances are for food manufacturers, for restaurants, and food service operations. And in both cases, the targets were tailored by the role that sodium plays in certain foods, given that sodium can play a very important role in food safety, flavor, color, texture, development, and much more. The key here is a broad, incremental, stepwise approach. We know that consumers' palates will adjust if the change is broad and gradual. And we've heard from many that having a common set of targets is very helpful. So we're showing here the different phases and the overall goals. The draft phase 2 targets build on those from phase 1 and aim to support further reductions over 3 years to 2750 milligrams per day, which, by the way, is the same goal for sodium reduction in healthy people 2030, which we recognize is still above the recommended limit of 2300 milligrams per day to reduce the risk for chronic disease, but would be a 20% reduction from levels prior to 2021, would have huge benefits at the population level. So now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Casey Hines, talk about the development of the guidance and the preliminary assessment of progress that we've conducted. Casey?
Thank you, Robin. Overall, there are 3 main steps in developing the targets, which is a time and resource intensive process. First is assembling the data sources, including packaged food label, restaurant menu, and sales data for the U.S. food supply. Then we develop the food categories and calculate the sodium sales weighted mean, or what we're calling the baseline for each category. Then finally, we develop 2 targets for each category. And we'll go into each of these steps in more detail in the next slides. So again, the first step in developing the targets involves assembling the data sources for the U.S. food supply. And this includes packaged food label, restaurant menu, and sales data for both packaged and restaurant food. Some of these data are purchased from commercial sources, which are shown here, and these sources are available for purchase publicly. The U.S. food supply has millions of products and is constantly changing, with new products being introduced and some coming off the market. So these are very large data sets that we're working with. We also collect some food package and restaurant data on our own here at FDA. We then clean the data and remove any duplicates and then link the different food label and sales data sets together. We then sort the data into the different food categories, and we have 163 food categories. And we convert the sodium for each product into milligrams per 100 grams. We then determine the top 80% of products by sales so that we're focusing on the products that are already selling well in the market. With these products, we calculate the sales weighted mean, or the average, for each category. This calculated mean is also what we are calling the baseline for each category. Then finally, we develop 2 targets for each category. The first is a sales weighted mean, or average, target for the category overall. And then second is what we call the upper bound target, which applies to individual products within that category. This is the level that we are hoping no one product would exceed. And in developing the targets for the categories, we have not taken a one-size-fits-all approach to the targets, and instead base the targets on what is known about food safety, food technology, and what we're seeing in the marketplace, as well as other information that is provided to us. For example, in general, there are minimal changes to the draft phase 2 targets for cheese due to the importance of sodium in cheese for things like microbial safety, stability, and other functions. In about 8 of 15 categories, the targets are the same as in phase 1 or less than 2% lower. More ambitious, that is, lower targets, are provided for certain cheese categories. So for instance, when restaurant baseline sodium levels were higher than the packaged food baseline levels, the restaurant subcategory may have had a larger reduction percentage. And for other categories, we've proposed greater reductions when this is supported by the data and when there were fewer concerns about food safety or food quality compared to, for example, cheese. Throughout the development of the targets, we reviewed market surveys, the published food technology literature. We consulted with food safety and other experts, and we also reviewed other sodium reduction initiatives around the world. And as mentioned, the draft phase 2 targets aim to reduce sodium intake to 2750 milligrams per day. We developed the targets to achieve this goal in a 3-step process. So first, we applied a % reduction to each category's 2022 baseline that was similar to the phase 1% reduction. This took into account category differences regarding the role of sodium in the food and the category's relative potential for reduction. Next, we evaluated each individual category against several factors that were mentioned previously to make adjustments to the % reductions. So those factors, again, included available published literature on sodium reduction technologies and comments that were provided to us, each food category's sodium distribution per product selling on the market in 2022, consultations with food safety and other experts, such as USDA, and progress that had been made by other countries in similar categories. And lastly, the resulting % reductions were applied to an NHANES model. And this was to validate that % reductions would achieve the population mean intake of 2750 milligrams per day. The key components of the guidance are shown here, and they include the guidance document itself, which provides background and information, and the Appendix 1 target table, which contains the food categories, descriptions for those categories, baseline sodium information, and then the 2 sets of targets, which are the sales weighted mean target for the category and the upper bound target, which, as mentioned, is intended for each product. So let's take a look at an example and the shifts that we're seeing between 2010 and 2022. This is the white bread category using the baseline data from the 2021 final guidance, the phase 1 targets. The number of products in this category is shown on the y-axis. Overall, as you can see, there are over 300 products in this category. And on the x-axis, the sodium concentration varies quite a bit from around 100 milligrams per 100 grams sodium to almost 800 milligrams per 100 grams. Again, these are the top 80% of products in this category. And you can see the spread in terms of sodium concentration, but that most cluster around 500 milligrams per 100 grams. The sales weighted mean or average for this category is 496 milligrams per 100 grams. And this is also what we call the baseline. The line added in green is the sales weighted mean, phase 1 target for the category. And in blue is the upper bound phase 1 target for individual products in this category. Again, we would hope no one product would go above that blue line. Now we're adding in the phase 2 data for this category, and we're still showing the phase 1 targets with the product data from 2010 in light blue, and the darker blue in the back is a changing distribution. You can see more products at a lower sodium concentration level and some that are higher as well. In this slide, we still show the 2010 and the 2022 distributions, but now we've added on the new 2022 baseline, which is 462 milligrams versus 496 milligrams in phase 1, and the draft phase 2 targets. And here we're only looking at the 2022 data with the baseline and targets. If we compare 2010 and 2022, we can see that there has been a shift in the average sodium concentrations, or those baselines, in this category to the left, which is what we are hoping to see. This slide shows that a little bit more clearly. So in terms of changes between the 2021 final guidance and the new draft edition 2 that was just issued, there have been updates to the goals and the targets. As mentioned, we're looking to support average sodium intake down to 2750 milligrams per day, which is the same as the Healthy People 2030 sodium intake goal. About 15 categories have been updated to include or exclude restaurant subcategories. These additions or exclusions were dependent on the available data. Some category descriptions have been updated as well, and there are a few additional examples of non-targeted foods that have been added. In terms of data sources and measurements, we used updated food label data from 2022 for the U.S. food supply and linked to sales data from 2021. We also collected packaged food images and data for about 7,000 products to supplement and validate our other data sources. And then we did collect restaurant menu data from 2022 as well. Finally, we reviewed about 300 food science journal articles on sodium reduction, as well as other sodium reduction initiatives, including Health Canada and their evaluation of their first set of targets. And we consulted with subject matter experts from our former Office of Food Safety and USDA's Food Safety Inspection Service. Now turning to the preliminary assessment of progress that we also issued, we compared the data from 2010 and 2022, recognizing of course that the target date for phase 1 targets was April 2024. There is a lag in data, so we don't know the full extent of the progress toward the phase 1 targets. But as of 2022, we can see that compared to 2010, in the pie chart on the left, in all categories, more than 50% showed decreases, about a third increased, and 14% showed no change. When we split out into packaged and restaurant food categories, we do see differences. So on the right of the packaged food categories, 62% decreased, 13% saw no change, and 25% increased. Of the restaurant food categories, 35% decreased, 16% showed no change, and 49% increased. We have also heard that for many restaurants, they are waiting on suppliers to provide lower sodium options, and that those options were anticipated to become more widely available in 2024. So we are hopeful that we'll see additional progress when we're able to analyze the full year of 2024 data. And we look forward to engaging more with the restaurant industry and their suppliers to help advance their sodium reduction efforts. This graphic shows the progress in sodium reductions between 2010 and 2022 as well for both packaged and restaurant foods combined. And this is broken out by the 16 overarching categories that we include in the target table. Green shows the percentage of categories that showed reductions, blue shows no change, and gray shows increases. And we were especially encouraged to see the reductions that were made in toddler and baby food categories between these years. For the 3 toddler and baby food categories as early as 2022, we can see that the average for these categories were already lower than the voluntary phase 1 targets. So again, this is very encouraging, especially as we know that the preference for salty taste can track into adulthood. So adjusting palates early could help with acceptance of lower sodium in school meals and could also pay dividends over a lifetime and reduce risk for later chronic disease. We can also see that as of 2022, 40% of the food categories had met or were within 10% of meeting the phase 1 sodium reduction targets. We have a number of other initiatives related to helping support lowered sodium intake listed here. For example, in 2020, we issued guidance on the term potassium salt instead of potassium chloride. The term potassium salt may signal to consumers that the ingredient is a salt substitute, and it could encourage manufacturers to use this sodium alternative to partially reduce sodium in relevant products. In 2023, the FDA issued a proposed rule to amend the standard of identity to permit the use of salt substitutes in foods for which salt is a required or optional ingredient. So if this is finalized, this proposed rule would provide manufacturers with, again, flexibility to use safe and suitable salt substitutes in standardized foods for which sodium chloride or salt is either a required or optional ingredient, and it could help facilitate industry innovation to reduce sodium in standardized foods like cheese, canned vegetables, ketchup. We also work closely with our federal partners on sodium reduction strategies. So other federal initiatives include CDC's monitoring and surveillance and food service guidelines, as well as Health and Human Services Administration for Community Living Senior Nutrition Programs. In addition, as we mentioned, we've worked closely on the targets with USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. And the draft phase 2 voluntary sodium reduction targets would work in concert with USDA's school meals sodium limit so that children have access to healthy choices inside and outside of school. For more information on our initiative, please check out fda.gov/sodium reduction, where among other things, you'll be able to find a link of the draft guidance. We provide the reminder here that we're requesting comments by November 14th. And when you provide comments, we are encouraging you to provide as much detail and data as possible, including rationale on anything that you submit. To stay connected with these initiatives and other updates from us here at the Human Foods Program, you can follow us on social media, and you might consider subscribing to our constituent updates so that you can stay up to date on any announcements. So thank you for the opportunity to share more about our efforts to help improve public health in the U.S. through helping to reduce sodium intake. And now I'll turn it back to Janisha Robbs, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. McKinnon, Ms. Hines, and Ms. Somber will now answer several of the questions received during the webinar registration process. Our first question is, why are these sodium reduction goals voluntary and not mandatory?
I can take that one, Janisha. So at this time, we're not exploring mandatory sodium targets. We're focused on the implementation of the voluntary targets. Currently, we believe that a voluntary iterative approach is the most effective and appropriate approach, and we're pleased to be seeing some initial progress already. Voluntary targets for a broad array of food categories have shown success in other parts of the world, as I mentioned, in Canada and the United Kingdom. So this is a reasonable approach for now. We think that the real value lies in allowing both the FDA and the food industry to have a common system for defining and measuring progress in reducing sodium in the food supply. And we'll certainly continue to engage with industry to learn about their successes, potential challenges in achieving the targets. As palates adjust to lower sodium, a company's product could taste overly salty by comparison. So we certainly encourage all industry groups to work towards the targets.
All right. Question 2. During the public consultation period for the phase 1 targets, FDA provided specific questions that they were looking for feedback on. Should the same questions be used in providing comments back to the FDA, or are there other questions that should be addressed by the public or industry that would be helpful for FDA?
I can take that one, Janisha. In 2016, when we issued the first draft guidance, it was the first time anyone had seen the overall approach that we were taking, including the initial set of categories and targets. So we had some specific questions that we wanted feedback on. And since then, we carefully reviewed the comments and finalized that guidance in 2021. So for this new draft guidance, it seems that many more are familiar with the process and the elements of the guidance. So to answer the question, it's up to each commenter on what you might like to comment on. However, similar to phase one, it can be helpful to hear comments on the categories and on the draft targets, providing as much detail and data as possible, and the rationale for those comments. Again, we welcome comments and we will review all very carefully.
Thank you for your answer. Moving on to the next question. One person asked, I would like to know how consumers react to the sodium reduction in food they consume, whether or not they noticed a difference in taste. If so, are they happy with the change? And do they add more salt or seasoning condiments to the food?
I will also answer that question, Janisha. As part of our development of the initial guidance, we assessed products selling well on the market, so the targets already take into account consumer acceptability. We took the same approach in developing the draft phase 2 targets. We know that people's palates adjust to lower sodium foods if the reductions in sodium happen slowly and are consistent across the board. There have been some studies looking at how consumers react to lower sodium foods. For example, participants in a residential study were provided with much lower sodium food and were told to add as much salt as they liked at the table. They found on average that people only added back up to 20% of the original level of sodium. We also know from some research that people don't typically notice small reductions of sodium. Our analysis of the food supply from 2022 shows that there are products selling well in the marketplace that are already meeting or are lower than the phase 2 targets.
Thank you. All right, the next question. Will the sodium levels of all the categories be further reduced in phase 3? Or will FDA take a more detailed look at which categories may need to be further reduced?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can jump in on this one, Janisha. Right, so right now we're focused on phase 2 and receiving feedback on these new draft targets. As mentioned, we're taking an iterative approach here, learning from one phase of targets to help inform another set. And as we've also noted, if the phase 2 targets are achieved, it would reduce sodium intake on average to around 2750 milligrams per day, which is still higher than the recommended upper limit for those 14 years and older of 2300 milligrams per day. So we'll continue to monitor the progress in implementing the targets. We'll be considering food safety, food technology to inform any future set of targets.
Great, thank you. The next question. Some food products do not have a clearly matched example listed in Table 1. For potentially ambiguous cases, would you be so kind to remind the public about what advice was provided during phase 1 implementation for selecting an appropriate food category?
Thank you, Janisha. I will answer that question. FDA updated category descriptions based on previous comments and questions that we received about the categories. We welcome comments on this topic, however. Should questions remain regarding categorization that prevent you from providing comments on this topic and you would like to do so, you can reach out to me directly. My contact information is provided in the draft guidance Federal Register notice, and we may be able to offer further clarity on the subject that will help inform your consideration of and comments on the draft guidance.
Thank you. All right, our next question. How is FDA measuring the impact of the phase 1 sodium targets on actual sodium intake in the United States?
Yeah, so I can speak on impact. So we're focused first on assessing the changes in the food supply, be it with using food label databases, restaurant menu data, sales data, because that's where we will see the most immediate impact. And then we would then expect to directly see changes in consumer intake. So we also work with other federal partners, USDA, CDC, to then, yes, assess the overall sodium intake using systems like the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and the dietary component of that.
Great, thank you so much. And our next question, the preliminary evaluation between 2010 and 2022 showed that some categories increased in sodium. What drove these increases?
Yeah, so our analysis of the food supply using the 2022 data is, again, it's preliminary. We don't know yet the full extent of the progress towards the phase 1 goals, but regarding the preliminary analysis, there's various reasons why we might see some categories increase in sodium. This mainly includes shifting sales of the top sellers, which may have been reformulated with lower sodium or even higher sodium. There's new product introductions into the category or even discontinuations of products, and also just the availability of data to us for the category. These can all impact measured category levels.
All right, next question. How will the targets work with healthy in front of package labeling?
Yeah, I'm happy to address this one. So the sodium reduction targets and the healthy sodium limits are complementary to one another and support the same overarching goal of helping to reduce sodium intake in the US. Sodium reduction targets are designed to lead to gradual reduction sodium across the food supply. For example, the phase 1 sodium reduction targets were designed to support decreasing average daily intake of sodium from about 3,400 milligrams per day to 3,000, and the draft phase 2 targets are intended to support reductions to 2,750 milligrams per day. The sodium limits under the proposed healthy definition, in contrast, are designed to be consistent with the dietary guidelines for Americans' recommended limit of 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day for those 14 years and older. So as a result, the proposed healthy sodium limits are generally lower than the sodium reduction targets. And for front of pack labeling, that can provide consumers with nutrition information like sodium to help folks notice and understand a food's nutrition content and to quickly and easily identify foods that can help them build a healthy eating pattern.
All right, so we have time for one more question. How were the reductions in sodium from baseline determined for each category? And why do some categories have steeper reductions than others?
Yeah, I can take this one. So we first applied a % reduction to each category 2022 baseline, similar to its phase 1 % reduction. So this took into account the category differences regarding the role of sodium in foods and the category's relative potential for reduction. And then next, really, there were several factors taken in combination that we considered when informing how to modify each % reduction. For example, we had the available published literature on sodium reduction technologies, past comments to the FDA, each food category sodium distribution for products currently selling on the market, comments from experts that we've received, for example, from USDA, FSIS, and also looking at progress that similar categories have made over in other country initiatives. So this information all collectively was reviewed by subject matter experts, and then adjustments were made to those initial % reductions as needed. And then, as mentioned in the presentation, the resulting % reductions were then applied into our NHANES model to then validate that the adjusted percentages were still achieving that desired end result of bringing it down to a population mean sodium intake of 2,750.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. McKinnon, Ms. Heinz, and Ms. Zomer. This concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available on the FDA's meeting webpage shortly. Thank you and goodbye.